I think, therefore I am. But I'm thinking all the time, and I don't know who I am. Am I? Are you? I'm in the middle of nowhere, and it's a good place to be. Welcome to Just Nowhere with Dr. Samuel Zinner. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Just Nowhere. I'm Dr. Samuel Zinner here in the mountain village of Aulla, Tuscany, Italy. Today we have a very special guest, Max Velmans, the Emeritus Professor of Psychology at Goldsmiths, University of London. So welcome to the program, Max. It's an honor.
Hello, Samuel. Yeah, looking forward to it.
It's an honor. Max, we live in this grand cosmos, right, of beauty and terror, right? And we find ourselves in it as conscious entities, as conscious beings. And there's a lot of theories, right? Traditional religious theories, all sorts of scientific theories that try to explain, right, the wonder of this fact of consciousness and awareness in this cosmic setting. And I think you have one of the most powerfully explanatory theories, right, on that explains consciousness or attempts to explain it. But before, and it's reflexive monism, right, is what you call it. But before we jump into a discussion on that, if I may, a personal question: what got you interested, right, in this subject, and caused you to devote your life and your research to it?
Well, that's a long story. It's as long, almost as long as my life itself. So
I understand.
really, I was interested in philosophical questions of that kind since about the age of 15. And I think that was due to the fact that I'd been exposed to many different situations, lived in 3 different continents, lots of changes of school, lots of exposure to different belief systems, including religious ones and so on. So in the end, I wound up fairly skeptical and challenging and lacking, if you like, a firm foundation for what we might call ontological security.
Yes.
It seemed, necessary to try and work things out for myself. But the journey into making that a career itself is quite a long story, because I started off doing engineering, actually, first degree in electrical engineering, and then found that while I was doing that, I was also interested in philosophy and of mind and existential philosophy, for example, and psychology, and began to try and combine those interests. When I did at the end of my engineering degree, my extended essay was on can machines think, or something of that kind, looking at early developments in cybernetics and self-guiding systems and pattern recognition systems and so on. And I then went straight on and did a full-time psychology degree as well. And then because I was still motivated by existential issues and what would be a really useful thing to do with my life, I actually traveled away from Australia, where I was based at the time. I wasn't born there, back to Europe, and wound up at University of London, wondering about the possibility of doing research in psychology with background in engineering and psychology. And then there's another long story, which I won't get into, which finally made the decision to work on consciousness. And basically, it just seemed to be the most central issue in terms of any possibility of addressing my own existential questions, and it was just the most interesting topic, full stop. Simply because, partly because it's been completely banned within psychology as something a serious scientist could study, and that meant in some ways there was a lot to do there, Yeah, I'm being very abbreviated here.
That's fine.
But if anyone's really interested, they could find out a lot more about it by having a look at my fairly recent online talk on Only Connect, a personal journey into consciousness. That's on YouTube.
All right,
So,
I'll put a link to that in the description.
yeah, no, there's an
Yes.
awful lot there that I don't want to waste our time,
Sure,
by
sure,
getting too
sure,
much into
sure,
that. Yeah.
sure. Well, but it is helpful just to have even the abbreviated version as we launch into this. All right, your theory to explain consciousness is called reflexive monism, right? And right now, as you know, this time, there seems to be um, another wave, right, a popular explosion in the theory of panpsychism. It comes in many flavors today: proto panpsychism, proto panpsychism. Right, there's a lot of these, and right, and Chalmers, of course, for a long time, right, has popularized this trope of the hard problem of consciousness. And all right, so your theory is called reflexive monism. So, right, so I think most listeners immediately will have the intuition that the monism, right, it has to be in contrast to dualism, but they might not be so familiar with just the general notion of reflexivity. But anyway, so you put them two together, and that's your theory. So, can you give us a basic outline summary of your theory of consciousness?
Okay, two words there. As you rightly say, monism suggests that ultimately the universe is one thing, which is pretty standard, really. And prior to differentiating, if you like, into parts.
Mhm.
And the reflexive bit is that ultimately the whole process of manifesting from, if you like, the one into the many, is reflective in the sense that if you like, the very process of it and arguably the purpose of it is in order to know itself in myriad ways. So going all the way from without any justification, to begin with, but just describing where it all goes. It views our own experience and struggles to understand ourselves and the world around us as part of a deep process, if you like, in the universe, a completely natural process in the universe, whereby the universe knows itself, in our case, in a particularly human way. And it would be just one of, infinitely many. But, to focus a little bit more on how you get there,
Yes.
I'll say a little bit about where it actually starts, giving, if you like, a quick, vignette of where it ends, without any justification so far. But it starts off with something really straightforward and immediate, which is how does our normal conscious experience relate to what we think of as a brain and an external physical world in everyday visual perception, like in the situation we're in now? So the conventional place to start with these three things, the visual experience, the role of the brain, and the relationship to the external world, is to say something like, I see Samuel out there on the screen. That's a physical entity.
Yes.
Light reflectances travel from the surface of the screen that I'm looking at, innervate my visual system. Various events happen in the brain, which, if you like, represent that input stimulus. Other conditions form, which provide the conditions for a conscious experience of that stimulus. And my experience of Samuel is something else. It's not this out there on the screen. It's if you're a materialist reductionist or a biological naturalist or something of that sort, you say, well, it must itself be a brain state because the causes, right, the proximal causes of that state are in the brain. If you're a dualist, you say, yeah, all those facts are true of the nature of perception, but the experience itself is not really anywhere. It's nowhere. So in a classical substance dualist position of Descartes' kind, it's literally not extended in space at all. It's res extensa is the physical stuff, and res cogitans, stuff that thinks, is the conscious bit. And so basically in a physical reductionist position, which is the dominant position in still, I think,
Yes.
but less so. Everything that needs to be explained is physical, basically. So in the end, the screen out there is physical, my brain is physical, the operations of my brain are physical, and the experience is just a state of the brain, so it's physical as well. That faces, as you say, the hard problem of consciousness, as Dave Chalmers was one person to point out. And then if you're a dualist, that experience isn't part of the physical world, it's completely outside of it. And so, if you like, it's almost like saying, to talk about the whole of the universe, you actually have to talk about two kinds of universes. There's the whole extended universe that physics studies and so on. But in addition to that, and completely not contained in it in any way, but interacting with that, is this other domain of reality, which we'll call the experienced reality, the world of consciousness. And these somehow interact. And then you get a classical problem within all, actually from the time of Descartes himself, originally raised by Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia in her personal correspondence with Descartes, which was, she found it inconceivable that substances as different as extended things and non-extended things could possibly causally interact. And then, so those are the two basic positions, and there's this great debate that's kind of gone on for 300 years or so about which might satisfy. Really, my starting point was a kind of shock to myself when I started thinking about trying to work out those things for myself back in 1975. And to begin with, the models that I've just described to you were precisely the models I also entertained. I thought, well,
sure,
what does consciousness do? Or maybe it's a state of the brain. Maybe it unifies the brain's operations or something of that sort. And then I realized that somehow my own presuppositions about my ordinary experience didn't correspond to my ordinary experience. And the truth of it is very easy to test, as we're all looking at this screen. And, one asks oneself, what actually is the nature of my visual experience as I'm looking at the screen? And if I'm looking at you, I don't actually have an experience of you that seems to be in my brain. And I don't seem to be having an experience of you that's located nowhere either. All I see, the only experience I'm having is you out there on a screen.
Right.
And that is my experience. And that's a bit odd, because I accept all the rest, that something's happening in my brain, and there really is an entity out there, a physical entity, i.e., something that looks like a screen. But it is an entity out there in the world, and there is a pre-conscious interaction between the entity out there in the world and my brain and so on. But the net result of my pre-conscious interaction between these events out there and the events in here, if you like, is to see you out there in space where you seem to be. And that's the reality. That's just the truth of the facts of the matter. And if that's true, then the entire debate about the nature of conscious experience as thought of by either dualists or reductionists is a debate about a theoretical fiction. There isn't such a thing in this case. Now, I'm not saying all experiences are like that, but basically what's going on is what I call a simple example of what I call a reflexive process. So basically, stimulus out there in the world engages with me, an observer, pre-consciously, as a result of which I experience the stimulus out there in the world in a particular way, as it seems to me. And so
Yes.
at close distances, it's also true that the experienced place of my experience of you is roughly corresponds pretty closely to where the screen actually is. That through biological evolution at close distances, these reflexive perceptions give you a pretty fair judgment about the distance of the things we perceive and so on.
Yes.
That corresponds to their actual distances. It breaks down at long distances. So if we look at the dome of the sky, at night, it looks like a dome, and all this, the stars on it seem to be equidistant. But of course, where the stars appear to be gives no accurate representation whatsoever about their actual distances.
Right.
But biology wasn't really interested in that kind of thing.
Right.
So just completing it, that's the first example of a reflexive process. So if I do something else where you can do it yourself, if you just touch your fingers together, pinch them together, and you ask yourself, where's the felt sensation? Now, it's a sensation we're talking about now, not a physical thing. Where's the tactile sensation?
Right.
And, is it in here?
Right.
Is it anywhere? Or is it just there at the fingertips? Well, I don't know about you, but in my case, it's down there, right at the fingertips.
Yes.
And so again, what's happened is, sense organs in the finger have been compressed, neural signals travel up to the somatosensory cortex. There's activation of the somatosensory cortex. But the net effect of all that is what you might call a psychological process, which are called perceptual projection, which is to produce a felt sensation down at the fingertips again.
Mm-hmm.
So it's again like that. Or if we go to Descartes' favored example and talk about thoughts, within psychology, we talk about verbal thoughts as phonemic imagery.
Mm-hmm.
And, if I had to kind of have a little think to myself, I'd find it very hard to actually locate where those thoughts are. But I would say they're somewhere in here somewhere.
Right.
And again, that's actually where the cognitive processes are taking place. So it's kind of absolutely self-reflexive as well. And that, if you like, then becomes a starting point for a process of theory construction, instead of starting with, if you like, what I think is a fictional account
Mm-hmm.
of the actual phenomenology of conscious experiences. You have to start with an accurate account of the conscious phenomenology of conscious experiences, and then get into the whole process of working out all the other things you want to understand. For instance, the relationship of this phenomenal world out here, which seems to be extended in three-dimensional space, to what's actually going on in my brain. What's the relationship of actual phenomenology to unconscious processes in the mind, for example? Mm-hmm. How are you going to make sense of things like subjectivity and objectivity? Clearly, we think of, anything observed out there in space classically as objective, whereas anything, being perceived is thought of as subjective. But if what I see out there in space is part of what I perceive, you can't quite think about it that way. It's still different to a thought, obviously, because we can intersubjectively share an experience of something out there in space, whereas you can't, if you like, experience my thought in the way that I do. But, those are just little bits of tinkering right at the beginning to show, demonstrate the kind of process of intellectual reconstruction that we need to get into. And then finally, and then there's the whole of my book, Understanding Consciousness, in its second edition, 2009, is about taking all those steps. And then right at the end of it, you get to this reflexive model of, if you like, the cosmos itself. And to do that, I have to engage a whole range of other stuff, which we can get into.
Sure.
But I think that kind of, if you like, initially answers, basically I'm saying, yeah, I've given you the end, so I think of, the cosmos as, if you like, self-manifests, observes itself, it's reflexive in that sense. And this microcosmic example I've just given you is how it actually plays out in microcosm. It's this something out there in space, or we can think of, for instance, the whole of this, you, me, everything, as a sea of energy and information. And you're a little vortex of it, over there. And I'm another little vortex of it over here. And preconsciously, the energy and information interchange between one vortex and another vortex, results in views of the whole thing. So, and being human beings, we have a particularly human view of the whole thing.
Sure, of
because
course.
we're built that way. And other animals will have different experienced realities and so on. But they're nevertheless engaging in this same process of both experiencing their own being, well, at least the more advanced ones, the more advanced biological systems and so on, and the experience of what surrounds them. And because all of us are still part of, if you like, the whole system.
Yes.
We become little manifestations of this reflexive process.
Yes, I remember when I first became aware of your reflexive monism theory, the thought occurred to me, all right, we have an experience, a subjective experience of observing the world. However, if we take a step back and realize that we are part of that world, right? So then that distinction becomes artificial, and sort of in a way that larger viewpoint, right, overcomes the experience of dualism, right? Anyway,
well, no, rather than dropping it, let me just add
sure,
a flourish to what you said, because
sure.
I think it's really important. So for all sorts of good, if you like, evolutionary biological reasons, it's important for us to distinguish, the bit that we usually associate with as ourselves, and we
Yes.
do indeed have a perspective on the rest, which does have something to do with the way we are constructed, and the point of reference, if you like, which for many people is just a little bit behind the
Right.
the middle of the forehead or something of that kind. And it's important to be able to distinguish what we normally think of as not us from us.
Right.
So all that has to be honored. But as you say, once you take a step backwards and you realize that from our individual perspectives, actually all those things are part of our experience. They're not apart from it. That then you get into the non-dualism.
Right.
In that sense, yes.
Right.
So then you can, in fact, if you go, well, among some of the Eastern traditions, certainly some of the paths towards non-dualism are arguably a realization of that very point, that actually, in terms of, if I just reflect on my experience and nothing else, then all of this that I observe is part of my experience. And then you can, if you like, forget all the conceptual categories that we've been dealing with, like me and other and so on, and just see everything as fluctuations in the flow of my experience.
Yes.
That isn't a complete story in my view, but that's how you would get to that form of non-dualism in my view.
Sure. Well, similar also, I think, right, from the the transition, right, from viewing what is, right, as either a whole or the parts of the whole. I mean, on their own levels, each is correct. Right.
Sure.
Yes. Well, so move on here a little bit, since I'm working currently with Noam Chomsky, and co-editing a book, right, with a chapter by him. Right, as I'm sure you know, Noam says he has this model, right? All right, so we have the speech, right, which is an outward act, and then we have silent speech, right, when we think to ourselves, and then we have the unconscious, right? Now, according to Chomsky, both the outward speech and the silent speech are actually part of the outward system of language. The inward is actually the unconscious, which is totally inaccessible to us. We might be able to maybe prod or shape it, right, and get it to respond, right? But it's basically inaccessible to us, which is, I suppose, why we call it the unconscious. But it does bring up the subject of the unconscious, or what you have also called the pre-conscious. And right, and so this is another raging debate right now about free will, and even physicists trying to jump in and trying to solve these philosophical problems. But in any case, all right, here, the image I've always used is, well, a human being can walk on their feet at a certain pace, but if you jump into an automobile, that motor and the wheel is going to take you where you want to go a lot faster. And so it seems the unconscious is what basically produces at this incredible rate our ability for speech production, right? So you and I, as we speak, we're not consciously choosing every word we're speaking. If that were so, we would really be dysfunctional, right? So, a healthy human being, it just seems to be almost automatically generated by these automatic unconscious processes, right? And so, right, it gives rise to this paradox, at least when you first start thinking about it. How can I have free will if my speech and my choices are so formed, right, by pre-conscious things? So how can something be free and not conscious? But I think you have a good solution for that, and that is that I, Samuel, or you, Max, each person is both their conscious and unconscious. Right, you can't throw away the other, because the other unconscious is about 90% of what we are. And you use the analogy of the tip of the iceberg. The ego or the consciousness is the tip of the iceberg. Now, here's a question for you, right? You have written that what is below the water, right, the rest of the iceberg, but the 90% of it down there, is being supported by the sea and by the earth. But I recall in one of your papers, you also wrote that larger part of the iceberg down there is supported by the universe. Do you recall that?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
All right.
Yeah,
So
sure.
what exactly do you mean by that?
Okay, you don't want me to gloss on the other stuff, but just talk about that. Yeah, or no, let me say a little bit
Or
about
whatever
the
you
other
want
stuff.
to.
Yeah.
You can go back and get to that point if you want to.
One of the first serious papers I actually produced was precisely about the sort of thing that Noam Chomsky was talking about. I wrote a target article published in 1991 in the Behavioral and Brain Sciences called "Is Human Information Processing Conscious?" And that was indeed focused on exactly that point, how much of, as you well described it, our ability to speak, for example, is predicated on enormously complex processes of the kind that have interested Chomsky for decades. Which you can infer, and but we don't normally have access to those processes, and within psychology, since about I think it was about 1971 that was called the cognitive unconscious. Yeah.
Yes.
So we're starting to structure the unconscious a little bit. We're saying, look, if you just do experimental psychology and nothing else, and you've been doing it, since the 1960s, then you would take it for granted that there's masses of evidence for a cognitive unconscious. Just to explain the kinds of tasks that we normally associate with cognition, like language, memory, learning, thinking, problem solving and so on. But then you don't have to stop there. So there's an older tradition of talking about the nature of the unconscious, which talks about, for instance, the psychodynamics of it. Well, I'm going to park the free will question for the moment. Just talk about the unconscious.
Yes.
And in the case of making a choice or something of that sort, let's touch a little bit on free will. You can ask the question, where does the wish to do something come from? So motivation starts creeping into the whole picture. And then you have to have, if you like, some sort of whole psychology to do with the nature of drives and desires, and and see how far you can get with just talking about them in biological terms, and so on. But human beings are a little bit more than rather complex biological machines. So classically within the psychodynamic traditions, for example, if we move away from the raw Freudian ideas, and I won't go into an evaluation of those, we're just mentioning them as a topic, if you like, we might get into questions of meaning. So Jung, for example, differentiated from Freud, well, for all sorts of reasons, but he felt it necessary to talk about the nature of a self, if you like, and the kinds of phenomena that made him, move in that kind of direction would be things like the idea of self-fulfillment and the notion that you might biologically be functioning as a successful member of the human species in midlife, and then not feel self-fulfilled, or have a sense of ontological emptiness, or have a lack of meaning in your life. And then you think, well, hang on, I know that doesn't scan in physics, but I am actually a psychologist, and I should be concerned with issues of central importance to human being.
Yes.
And the notion that the model of meaninglessness, if you like, that follows from, if you like, a purely clockwork picture of the universe with randomly interacting but evolving bits and pieces, actually is deeply unsatisfying to the human psyche, you might say. Yes. And then you might say, well, hang on a moment, I'm also a part of all this. Why, if that's true, does it feel unsatisfying? And then there are two possible reasons. One, and then people go in two directions. One would be, it somehow is biologically advantageous to the survival of the species to be unsatisfied, or whatever just so story you might concoct. Or you might say there's something missing in the model. And then there are a whole range of other phenomena that don't fit into any of these things. So, people have extraordinary experiences of many different kinds. And because I'm interested in consciousness, both as well, as I said right at the start, just personally, as well as intellectually.
Sure.
Then whenever people tell me a true story about some amazing experience they've had, I don't assume for right at the outset that because it doesn't fit into my model of the world that I have to reject it. And there are entire areas, for example, which of human experience which don't easily fit into that dead mechanical model of the world.
Right.
And when people have these experiences, often they would describe them as the deepest experiences they've ever had. So, for example, they have had a mystical experience or something of that kind. Then not only is it life transforming for them, But it opens up the question of what's the ontological status of such things, and a lot of this is happening at the moment. We're gradually starting to get back, but now from an experiential point of view, if you like, to some of the options that you were discussing at the start. The renewed interest in panpsychism and even cosmopsychism, which is a deeper position than panpsychism, and also in the end where reflexive monism goes. But if I'm coming back to your question of how do you get to the sea, what's the sea? Well, the sea is, if you like, the fundamental reality of the world in which we're immersed, or the cosmos in which we're immersed. And the attitude I take to that is that, although it might be the case that, the deepest realities might be beyond, little human beings like you and me and so on, nevertheless, because we're part of it all, there are ways of exploring, if you like, which get us more closely in touch with it. And obviously, standard one would be physics itself. If you're taking a third person approach to all this and saying, look, what's the fundamental nature of being? Then you can go as far as you can with the physics available. That's fine. But then I would say, that's not the only approach that you can take. There are two other things you can do. One is to do something of the kind that I've been starting to do, but only in a very preliminary way in answer to your question, which is to do a kind of reverse engineering, where you say, look, this is us here now. What kind of universe, what kind of reality could have produced how it is for me here and now, and for me that has two basic things that need explaining. Both the fact that things do appear out there seem to be objects and so on, and they seem to live their merry lives, whether or not I experience them or not, irrespective of any experiences I might be having. But there's also the fact of my ability to experience all that. So somewhere in the initial conditions of the universe, you have to have something which does both things, something that both manifests, in terms of all the things that we can observe and measure and, do our science on and so on. But in addition, allows us to experience all those things, which underpins our ability, of course, to do the science and so on.
Yes.
And somehow these things co-emerge. And then the sea, if you like, are the primal conditions, whatever they may be, which allow this co-emergence to evolve. And although we're far less in our normal lives in touch with that often, at least in its details, than I won't say less in contact with that than our normal cognitive unconscious, because we can't just introspect and work out what our own cognitive processes are. Right. But these are, if you like, the conditions which lead to allow the cognitive processes to evolve in the later stage of evolution and so on. And then there's a third route. The final route is because we're, in this way of looking at things anyway, part of everything. We're not freaks of the universe. Tiny pinpricks of consciousness in a completely unconscious, insentient, randomly mechanical clockwork machine. Right. With no significance and complete accidents. In this other view, it flips completely, and you say, look, we're a normal expression of what the universe is like, of a very particular kind, and therefore our consciousness and our conversation we're trying to work things out for,
Right.
what's going on, how do we make sense of
Hmm.
all this?
Hmm.
It's part of the process of what is manifesting into, all these tiny little individual bits, which in turn then try and understand themselves. And part of that, and this is the final bit of this, if you like, bit of what I'm saying, the third way of approaching this is actually through one's own inner experience. So there's more than one way to probe the depths of things. And the classical Eastern approach has been to explore the depths of the nature of being within one's own mind. So one has to kind of, give a little caveat to saying, look, introspectively, we can't access the deeper regions of our own being. There are various approaches, quite a lot of them actually, by which individual humans have found they can get in contact with one or another aspect of the nature of their own being, all the way down to what, for some of them, they experience as a deep contact with the ground of a particular kind. And that's reflected, for example, in Hindu, the Hindu phrase, thou art that, tattvamasi,
Yes.
by which they mean an experience which, both seems to be of the ground of being and recognizes that ground of being as the source of one's own sense of self. And so I am that, even though in this form I'm just this, if you like. So then you get the whole sense of different levels. You get, if you like, the ground of being, and you get, the formative principles and the basics of the universe, which led to some sort of manifestation. You get the laws of physics. You get psychospiritual laws or psychophysical laws, if you like, which also determine, if you like, not just the physical evolution, but the psychophysical evolution of the universe, at different levels of scale. That's
right, which brings to mind Wolfgang Pauli's psychophysical model, right, which seems to me quite similar, right, to yours. Is there some way in which it diverges, or do you see it basically as the same? Because it's in a nutshell, right? It's that there is a primary state from which this seeming duality of the psycho and the physical derive. There's actually a monistic, right, origin to those two.
No, I think that's right, and I actually do quote, some of the relevant quotes from Pauli, in my book. And you've touched on something important here, that in my view, Pauli does absolutely subscribe to the notion of psychophysical, a psychophysical language.
Yes.
And I have had the odd little difference of opinion with Harold Atmansbacher, for example, who is responsible for many of the translations of these interactions of Pauli with Jung and so on, because Harold likes to talk about information in a more neutral way. And I want to say, and this relates also to Chalmers, because Chalmers, he also has this neutral expression for information. If you just say information is the basis of everything, and here I stand to learn something from physics, if they manage to actually secure the it from bit theory. But there's a prima facie problem, which is from something in which physicality is totally absent as we normally understand it, and from something which experience is normally absent as we normally understand it. How do you get that from something that's just information? there's a principle here which comes from Parmenides, which is that nothing comes from nothing. That it's a rejection of the idea that there are, so to speak, sudden gaps in explanatory power somewhere. You either, have a kind of sense of, oh, this is how it really could have happened. If we go with these grounding assumptions, you get, if you like, at least the possibility of a smooth evolution. And for instance, in my 2021 paper, I don't know if you've read it, is the universe conscious? That's online for anyone who's interested in that.
Sure, I'll put a link to it.
Yeah, no,
in the description.
This goes well beyond my understanding consciousness in the second edition, 2009.
Right.
As far as I can see, in order to, if you like, get the whole thing going, in order to support the whole system, you need two necessary ingredients. You need something like a primordial form of consciousness. You need something like a primordial form of energy, and you need a sort of what you might roughly call dynamic information, which allows you to formulate those into infinitely many varied forms. You have to have that a possibility of structuring and so on. But you need those two ingredients, and that, if you like, gives you a psychophysical universe.
Right.
And I also want to say, in the same way that we've been doing it with ordinary visual experience, you can take that all the way up to, my mind and your mind now, and it manifests this combination of energetic and the energy and the possibility of connecting the mass to the energy and so on, and the potential for experience to what in our particular manifest form becomes a kind of first and third person aspect,
right.
accessible dual aspect theory of mind. The nature of mind, of the human mind, is, in my view, psychophysical. But there are two modes of accessing, if you like, the psychological and the psychological bit and the physical bit. So if you look at it from the outside, it looks physical. If you observe the operations of your own mind from an internal point of view, all you get is experiences. Chomsky's point.
Right.
But that's the conscious access to the nature of mind, and the other one is the physical access to the nature of mind. And the mind must be something that supports both of those. And it's different in the ground of being, where you don't get first and third person perspectives. It's a form of being that combines these.
No, it's prior to the distinction.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
prior to the distinction.
Yes. I like the physicist George F.R. Ellis, his phraseology, right, for what happens before, quote unquote, before the universe begins, right? So there must be some possibility state. He first did it that way, right? So there. So what? Right, in the beginning, there must be this possibility state, but not only for physics, not only for logic, because he talks about the possibility space of logic. So all the logic that we use, right, in our human reasoning, there are possibilities and there are impossibilities, and that possibility space, right, pre-existed the universe in his opinion, right? So this is why things are the way they are, because it's a result of the possibility space. It couldn't be any other way, right? But he also talks about the possibility space of meaning, right? That pre-exists, and of morality, right? If not ethics, which are culturally determined, but morality, right? Universal, right and wrong. And it's quite interesting. So he seems to be linking physics, right? With the sense of morality, with the sense of meaning. It's whatever the merits of it is. It's a fascinating theory. But when you were talking about the different possibilities, um, I was reminded of another physicist, that is Nima Arkani Hamid, and he has this idea. Well, he brings attention to the way that, and I'll be brief with this, right? The way that gluons interact, right? So you can have two gluons interacting with a single gluon, or one gluon interacting with another. But what's important about this is that these then begin to amalgamate, these triadic structures then begin to amalgamate. Now, each of these triadic building blocks lack space-time or quantum mechanics. But the amalgamation, the full volume or the amplitude, now it has it. Right. But what is central to this is that there are many, many, many possible permutations, right, of these triadic configurations and amalgamations. And it is these sets of permutations, right? And of course, now we're into combinatorics, right, in math. These combinatorial permutations that give rise, so they're mathematical structures, basically, that give rise to space-time and quantum mechanics. So behind it, right, so this does seem to be like a Neo-Pythagorean model, even though Arkani Hamid doesn't go there, doesn't mention that, but it does seem to be like a part of the Wheeler's, right, its or bits, right, model. And I think it's a very promising trajectory, right, in physics and beyond physics, because it's being adopted, of course, in trying to understand psychology and cognition and consciousness as well. That it's astounding. My friend Gregory Chaitin, right, a prominent mathematician, philosopher, also, we've had this conversation with him. I think it's pertinent to what you said, and that is, he says, right, depending on how you approach this problem of consciousness and then the matter, if you come at it from one angle of energy, you're hard pressed to find where matter comes from. So there's an explanatory gap, right? But if you come at it from a purely materialistic, what is traditionally considered materialistic viewpoint, then you're hard pressed to explain the origin of consciousness, right? And so again, I think that your model really is helpful. That's why I call it powerfully explanatory, right? And that's the merit of a good scientific theory or hypothesis, right? What can it actually explain, right? And how powerful is the explanation? And also, many of these types of powerfully explanatory models, right? They turn out to be based on very simple structures, very simple truths. And how more simple can one get than monism, right? That this, there's a monistic base, right? That on a secondary, tertiary, or whatever, on later levels, right, appear to be dualistic, right? But collapse into this monism once you can take a larger view of it all. It's sort of mind-bending. Have you ever thought about the relevance of autistic savants for the question of understanding the unconscious? Because, for instance, Daniel Tammet, there's a famous video, last 5 hours. He's reciting the first over 22,000 digits of pi, right? And even lower lower IQ autistic savants, can do things that are equally impressive. Like I know sometimes some of these stories we have to take them with a grain of salt and make sure that they're actually verifiable. But there's one that I remember from Oliver Sacks in his book with that magnificent title, "The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat." Right, the two autistic twins. Right, they see someone throwing a handful of toothpicks onto a table or a floor, I forget what it is, and they both simultaneously immediately say 111. They know how many are there, right? And so Alan Snyder, his theory is that the autistics are able to directly access this data in the unconscious, whereas the rest of us, we can't do that, right? And of course, reciting the first 22,000, I think it's 22,514 digits of pi, maybe transposing a few of the last final digits there, but it's over 22,000. But doing that sounds mind-boggling, except if you step back and here, I forget his name, but there's an Israeli medical doctor who pointed out that it's similar. What's going on there is similar to a pianist, for instance,
To
right?
what?
To a pianist, someone who's playing,
Oh, a pianist.
let's
Yeah.
say, yes,
Yeah.
Let's say Rachmaninoff's Third Piano
Sure.
Concerto in a live
Yeah. Yeah.
concert.
Mm.
They have not memorized all those thousands of notes.
Mm.
They have, but it's here. The memorization is
Mm.
here, right? And of course, in coordination with their hearing and their sight. But it's as if the entire body, of course, is the information processing organism, right? And so there's if there's this kind of data, right, in this the lower 90% of the iceberg, right, and if there are techniques for even non-autistic people, right, to somehow tap into at least a certain degree of it, then what I'm getting at is, right, is there a possibility that in altered states of consciousness or whatever techniques that might be used to sort of release some of that data up into the conscious area, isn't there a possibility for just access of tremendous insights, tremendous data? Um, it seems that this is really a field that could be fleshed out more and really could be researched for, but we are limited because we don't fully understand this phenomenon of autism, right? But have you ever gone there, thought about that,
Well,
the relevance of it?
it surely is relevant. What's so interesting about these outliers, is that they kind of just sit there, but they, in the end, force you to re-examine the completeness of your entire, if you like, view of what's going on. And if one had to give a generalization of some of those amazing things that you've listed, it would be that humans, anyway, admittedly, of different forms and different circumstances, are able to access information in all sorts of ways that most of us can't. I certainly can't. But one thing that comes to mind there is the idea that if one's looking, if you like, for a kind of explanation of why most of us can't do most of those things most of the time, it would be something really simple, like for most of us, most of the time, it wouldn't be terribly useful for us in terms of our everyday interactions with the world and so on.
Sure.
So it's a two-edged thing with the autism, for example. So by the very virtue of the very label,
Right,
it comes at a cost.
Yes, and other areas.
Yeah, and so the notion of maximizing, if you like, survivability for everyday purposes would normally trump, a specialized ability of that sort.
That's right. Yes.
And but the fact that it exists at all, has to sit there as something that, in the end, you want to be able to explain in some sort of way, because we tend to be very, unsurprisingly, we tend to be very driven by, the norm, and tend to have a tendency to classify anything outside of the norm as pathological, inexplicable,
Irrational
yeah, or faulty data or whatever. Yeah,
pseudoscience.
exactly.
Right.
And
Yes.
okay,
Yes.
now that you mentioned pseudoscience, the a whole range of other phenomena of that sort. So in my line of work, I come across people who have all sorts of interesting experiences of many
Of
different
course.
kinds,
Yes. Yes. Of
and
course.
I never dismiss any of it, really. You can always ask yourself, what's the status of that bit of knowledge and so on. But there are a whole range of phenomena, all of which suggests that there's more information to have access to than we normally have access to, which we can have access to potentially in some
Potentially.
cases.
Hmm.
A wonderful example of this kind, which to me is the simplest one,
Hmm.
is um, um, I don't know if this has ever happened to you. Have you ever had the sense that somebody's staring at you? You turn around
Sure.
and they
Sure.
are. Yeah.
Sure. I
Or you
even
stare
from
at
childhood.
somebody. Yeah, you
Yeah.
stare at somebody and embarrassingly they turn
Right.
around.
Yes. Yes.
Now, we all know that feeling of being stared at, and but that's even that can't be explained, if you like, in terms of the normal, sensory cues that we have available to us. There's
Hmm. Hmm.
nothing literally coming out of the eyes, which is, and the only obvious place to look for the source of that is to say, look, in a very simple way, that exemplifies an unconscious connection between people. And,
Yes.
and that only becomes manifest, in certain sorts of circumstance. And once you're in that territory, you get into far more interesting things going on. So you might say, look, in every everyday conversation, shall we say, between both close friends and strangers and so on, there's a lot of unconscious stuff going on in terms of people making assessments of each other, and
Certainly.
and there's also the business of entering into a shared unconscious space, if you like. In a deep conversation, we have deep contact with somebody, and there's a kind of space of shared meaning, if you like, which one can recognize in terms of the feeling that's associated with that kind of conversation and that kind of closeness, or that sense of maybe being seen that people describe, when actually they're having an authentic conversation with each other. There's simply words coming out of their mouths and so
Hmm.
on. But if you're looking at the surface, manifestations of that, but there's a deeper contact that's implicit in there as well. And I'm very inclined to say, look, that whole space, if you like, of unconscious being, um, um, which we don't normally have access to
Hmm.
completely, nevertheless makes itself felt all the time, in the kind of deeper feelings that, what we would personally call deeper feelings about what's going on, or deeper intuitions and so on, sometimes which are not even formed, explicitly. One might have a deep intuition about something,
Sure.
and then you can ask, where's that coming from? And it's coming from tapping into, if you like, an area of our unconscious mind is actually grasping something, or starting to see a pattern in something which explicitly we don't yet have a way to access. And
Right.
I mean, there are amazing things, well evidenced, really, where mother might have a sense that their son is in danger on the other side of the
Yes.
world,
Hmm.
and or that a relative has died,
Yes.
and that starting to, if you like, be in the area that you mentioned. Other people would say, oh, it's just pseudoscience, because it doesn't fit
Even
into
though
my
everyone
model.
has these experiences,
Exactly. And
everyone has them.
yeah, and part of the work I do is to, if you like, insofar as there is a game plan,
Hmm.
is to to actually at least for myself, think about all those things in a way that makes sense to me. Yeah,
Mhm.
completely honors the science. I don't deny any of that stuff. But is open to, this wider range of possibility, if you like, which none of us have explored in anything like the kind of depth in the end that will need to be explored in order to open up the potential of the sorts of things that you mentioned, which is that more of us can tap into.
Yes, let me go out on a limb, as they say. Right, I have wondered, right, if, and it's a big if, let's say if the block universe model is correct, that right, the eternalist model that past, present, future coexist simultaneously, and like Hermann Weyl would explain that, and our consciousness is able to travel along this four-dimensional world line, right, 1 second, so to speak, at a time, right? So we can't see ahead or behind. Usually we can remember the past, right, and we can predict the future, but we can't know it, right? But if all of that exists as a Minkowski block world, all right, could this help explain what are usually called precognitive dreams? So that down in the unconscious, there is more data about the past and future that's already there, at least in that physics model, right? And somehow in dreams, sometimes you get a glimpse of a couple pages ahead in the cosmic book, right? And it usually I doubt there's anyone who has not had at least one of those types of dreams where somehow it was seeming to foretell the future. Now, usually I don't think, in clear ways, but a very symbolic language. And then you look back after the event and you can say, well, yeah, not in every detail, but the general scenario in the dream, wow, yeah, it played out the next day or whenever, right? And so is the data that's down there, and that 90% of the hidden iceberg, also temporal data, right? Anyway, just a wild, I know it's far out there, but
yeah, I agree with you. It's far out there, but I don't dismiss it either. I have some interesting stories to tell of my own, in terms of things I've observed of that kind, which lead me to be pretty open to those possibilities. Let's put it that way. I don't want to tell the story now, but
sure. But if there's a block world in that way, so it would be totally, there'd be nothing supernatural about these types of experiences.
No, I think there is a kind of issue about getting back to free will. That whether, if you like, in the human story, there is a kind of block world in the sense of the whole line is already predetermined and so on. I don't think I would kind of go with that, actually. But what one might be able to tap into, and this is just my off the cuff guess.
Sure.
Would be, if you like, unconscious access to data that suggests the trend of something.
Sure, that's
in other words, it's a little bit
it.
like certain possibilities are opening up. Conditions have obtained, which one has no conscious access to, but one somehow unconsciously does. That might lead one to start predicting that with a certain probability, a certain kind of event is likely to happen, even though it's just expressed as a kind of feeling. And that allows, for example, those instances where people avoid something deliberately because they have a strong feeling. That, and that's
plane
the kind
crashes.
Of thing. Well, I have a personal, it wasn't me who had the premonition, but I have a most dramatic example of that sort, which persuades me that it's real. Yeah.
Yes, They seem to be
Yeah.
ubiquitous,
Yeah.
so it's,
Yeah. So
so
I would agree, and
we,
that's all part of allowing ourselves to at least entertain those things as meriting, examination, and then not building theories which a priori exclude those possibilities.
right.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, we have to come up with hypotheses and then try to falsify them, and try not to be biased. I forget who it was who pointed that out. The first thing in science is not to fool anyone, meaning yourself. Right. You have to be aware of your own biases and all of this, and try to control them. Right, because we can't get rid of them totally, but we if we're aware of them, we can try to, right,
Sure.
adjust and control, and be careful in that respect. This has really been fascinating, and you're quite eloquent. A final question, if I may: are there any new ideas you're engaged with, or that you would like to pursue, or not only that, but in the field of consciousness studies, where you would like to see it go?
Well, well, two questions there, obviously. So
Yes,
anything
yes.
I might do, and so on. I'm thinking of doing something a little bit more elaborate about how one justifies, if you like, the departure point for the monism. This notion of
Mm,
consciousness and energy and information and so on. To put that on a more solid basis, so that is something I could do something more on than I've done already, and have it in mind. In terms of where I like it all to go, two things. One is, if you like, a greater openness, if you like, to the full range of human experience, and a willingness to, be cautious, of course, and as rigorous as you like, but not to assume that the whole of human being is somehow contained in the current models that we have of it. I'm sure that's wrong. And the second bit, which I think is more urgent, is that we're in a mess. And there are all sorts of reasons for that mess. But part of the reason, one contributing factor to the reason, is this kind of instrumentalist, mechanical view that we have of nature and
yes.
our place in it. So if you're a staunch Darwinian and you think that although I wouldn't necessarily accuse Darwin himself of going in this direction, but if you interpret that in a purely competitive, disconnected way, you're out there, I'm over here. The whole meaning of life is for me to propagate my genes or whatever, to greater rate than you can propagate yours, and so on. And basically life is a competition, and to the winner go the spoils, and bad luck to the hindmost, and all that stuff. We are destroying the planet, and we are also at risk of destroying ourselves.
Yes.
And the need for realizing our embeddedness and interconnectedness, as well as our potential, needs not only exploring in an active sort of way, and many people realize that intuitively, and people talk about it in many different ways, but within the formal field of consciousness studies, we also need integrative models that also allow for the interconnectedness and mutual dependence of both us on each other and on the surrounding planet, and so on, and to see that actually, and this is again something that's actually happening, that intelligence, if you like, is spread around everything. That there's some fascinating stuff coming out of study of forests and and trees and even at the cellular level, that the cells aren't just competing with each other, but they're kind of cooperating with each other and sharing with each other and exploring the potential for evolution and so on. They're exploiting in this kind of sensitive interconnection, both with each other and their surrounding context. What kind of complexity, different complexities that might foster that, help them both, help the bits and pieces that are in contact with each other, and so become symbiotic and so on.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so in the end, we wind up with a different metaphysics of interdependence, if you like, and I suppose my last take-home line would be something like, we kind of wind up with a vision of reality in which we belong, as opposed to one in which we're kind of these isolated little freakish bits of consciousness in a dead universe, and trying desperately to survive and get more stuff. And,
yes.
Because there's this gap, if you like, an existential gap, which can't be filled in that way. But if you realize, hang on, in the depths of this gap, there's all sorts of interesting stuff, in layers of our own unconscious being. There's something well worth getting connected to and expressing and becoming deepened in our own processes by doing so, that kind of thing. And I think the work, somebody like me does, and, many different people do in their own different ways, can help a little bit, towards that kind of movement in the way we are.
Sure. Yes. Well, let's all work for that goal. All right. And Max, thank you so much for joining me on the program today. This has been so enlightening and refreshing, I would say. And again, I would say you're quite eloquent. And everybody, thank you for joining us today here at Just Nowhere, and we'll see you next time around.
And thank you for having me. Yeah.
You're quite welcome.
Yeah.
If you enjoyed the program, please consider supporting this channel with a donation through Patreon or PayPal. And don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.